I was just, when I was talking to a few people just outside before we came in, and obviously talking about some of the off-site challenges, and I've known Rory for a long time, and just kind of smacked of me of the question that Paul raised about, well, this has been on the edges for quite a long time, and I remember John Prescott in his old modern methods of construction, the old MMC thing, and I thought, good grief, that has been around a while, or maybe I'm just getting older, not really sure which, and yet it does feel that as we are in a position where more and more people like Rory are talking about a real evidence base and a business case for actually being able to deliver these things rather than being, the very ad hoc, exemplar, idealistic approaches that sometimes we've seen in the past. So that's very welcome. And I think also kind of the backdrop to what I'm just going to talk about is around, clearly broader issues in construction that that I get involved with around ethical and responsible matters in relation to construction materials, assets, and so on. But I think in this context of just how big an issue house building is for our industry, for our nation, is so inherently fundamental, and a whole generation of people who now can't afford to buy a house because the market just isn't there for them, and people being priced out. There's a generation rent and all these other societal problems that we are now creating for generations to come. So don't think we can underestimate the sheer social value in its holistic sense of what it is that we're actually going to try and make some sort of impact into. And some of the particular areas that I think that really sort of chimed with me with that Rory was talking about, which I'll probably try and touch upon as well over the next 10 minutes or so, is the relation in terms of how we have traditionally built things in our industry, and now how we're trying to recognize all these sort of externalities, all these other sort of risks that we have in our supply chains, particularly from my perspective, looking at our environmental, social, ethical risks that we might be facing. And some of it can be managed and some of it can be understood better through a procurement lens. And I think we're starting to see an evolution of recognizing how we procure and how we build is actually becoming more and more part of the conversation that we need to have. And I think this is, again, part of that very important conversation that we continue to have. So a few things that I'm going to give a sense of shortly is a bit around the context of the responsible and ethical sourcing agenda, how that's evolved in our industry over quite a number of years, kind of bring us up to where we are today, how I see the role of standards perhaps evolving and what we've seen of late and what we're going to see in the coming years to come, to give a sense and idea of what that might mean for us as organisations, us as businesses, and others in the room today. But also perhaps give some thoughts as to where that might go in the future, and how is emerging technology going to perhaps help hinder or at least pose some other questions that we might have in terms of how we are going to govern our supply chains in the future as well. So hopefully I'll give you a breadth of all of that. So if we go back maybe 20 odd years or so, people were talking about stewardship in our industry and materials in particular. We have had the FSC type chain of custody models around for quite some time, and often akin this to good governance and how are organisations evolving over periods of time. And over the years we've seen lots of corporate organisations take a particular stance on trying to be more ethical. We had a load of work around the fair trade movement with retailers and supermarkets and so on. And we've seen a huge kind of gradual societal shift. So whereas perhaps some of the organic or free range type products and things in supermarkets were relatively fringe, maybe 20 odd years ago, but in many organisations and retailers they are now common practice. So you can't really go to the co-op now and buy eggs from eggs from cage hens. They're all free range. And McDonald's are very good at the provenance of them, constituent products and food stuffs as well. So we're seeing lots of these things kind of happen all around us. And actually there's this issue around the governance that an organisation is putting into what it is doing and how it is procuring and how it's behaving, and with the expectation of consumers and procurement professionals in the sense in our industry in terms of what are they getting. So actually by the nature and the very nature of who I want to buy my materials from, and is it a reputable organisation? Is it an organisation I can trust? Is it an organisation that has great ethical prowess, shall we say, and track record of doing the right things, shall we say? And does that give us more assurance and comfort that actually by buying from some of these things that we were always talking about, getting the specification right, so it's not value engineered, so we know who it is that we've decided to specify our materials from, actually helps us and gives us more assurance in terms of the asset and the quality of what we're getting for the longer term, rather than it being, the old VE term that I used to get an awful lot of times. I used to sell concrete paving for a living for a while, and it's some very incredibly nice paving, as you can imagine, some very aesthetic paving. And because external paving and hard landscaping would often be towards the end of a project in a traditional build, often it was value engineered out. So I might have had a fantastic specification for a very nice buff, black fleck type paving slab. And by the time it got to the end and it was, they run out of money, and quite frankly, if I got a grey slab in there, that was a result. So how do we kind of build in all these things? Because if you've got a decent specification with the right company for all these other attributes from an ethical and responsible perspective, and then for it to be VE'd out, not only are you reducing the quality potentially, you're introducing risk into that supply chain of, well, we've just gone and got the cheapest thing from around the corner because that's where we ended up. So we're losing so much more than just saying, okay, it was £4.80 a square metre and now it's £2.50. Okay. So I think there's lots of these things that we need to understand, and we've seen that evolution of organisational governance, how companies are taking the responsibilities on themselves, I think is incredibly important. And I think that is really important for us as a business, as BRE, the work that we do, particularly my particular part of the business. So we've got a responsible sourcing standard that's been out for over 10 years now, which expands beyond just timber products, a range of other construction materials that are starting to look at this as well. But inherently they've tended to be products that with much shorter supply chains, so aggregates, concrete, things of that nature. And only in the last couple of years have we started to see more and more complex products, assembled products, start to understand and recognise their own challenges with responsible ethical sourcing in the context of standards. And I think that's going to be a gradual learning curve for lots of organisations. We've got one company that we've done a lot of work with, Dakin, around air conditioning systems. But we're starting to dispel a lot of these myths, because for many years when I was in the quarrying industry, there was a notion that, a quarrying company who makes concrete, or he just breaks the rocks for a living, the provenance and the sourcing considerations are relatively simplistic, shall we say. So you can just look at the hole in the ground and go, that's where I got it from. It's from Leicestershire, and we put it on a train and it went to London, and it's really quite straightforward in a sense. But when you start to get into more complex products, your LEDs and different constituent materials and assembled products and systems, then that starts to introduce complexities. But I think gradually we're recognising that there's more companies that are taking on that governance aspect themselves and saying, well, we need to understand what our risks are in our own businesses, in our own supply chains. Actually, it then leads us to being able to produce better products, have more assurance, more confidence in what it is we're putting together. And hopefully that means from a procurement perspective, it gives more options to have a lot of this built in at the very beginning. And I think other things are in terms of the social value, the benefit. What do these sort of standards and things give us? So if we go back sort of 10 years, I wanted to kind of touch upon the aspect of the evolution of standards as well. So many of you are, I guess, there's a couple of house builders here. Any contractors? No? Okay, have they all gone already? That's amazing. We have a few architects, I presume, local authorities, housing associations, client-type bodies. Okay, great, thank you. So how we procure, is incredibly core to all of this thing. But when we talk about the role of standards, lots of people talk about, have you got quality systems? Again, coming back to the theme of the day around quality. Have you got 9001 as a quality system in your business, in your supply chain, the quality of the products and the manufacture processes? Okay, great. That's great. We can see that. Have you got 14001 for environmental management systems? Yes, we've got that as well. Have you got 18001 for health and safety management? Oh, yes, we've got one of those as well. And then we've kind of got this been at this crossroads for a few years now, where lots of these things in terms of management system standards have become pre-qualification requirements, become another Me Too. I've seen lots of organisations often maintain their certificate because they need to get their 14001 because they need to keep it for whatever. But is that actually driving the improvement that they need to be doing in their own businesses for their own benefit, and therefore realise the value unto themselves? And I think this is an important thing for us to consider, as lots of these standards are actually evolving. So if we look at the 9001, 14001 sort of management system space, over the last, about 2 years ago, they had updated versions, and the context of what they mean to a business is now much, much broader than it ever was before. So how many people in this room have their businesses have got 9 or 14 in some shape or form? So we've got a few. Great. And so for those of you who've got it, you're probably, if you're not involved in it directly or your colleagues are, those standards are evolving and increasingly becoming much, much more about the context of your organization, trying to look at a life cycle perspective of what your products are, what is your responsibility, what is the custodianship, the stewardship of what it is you are doing. So if you're a house builder or whatever, fine, we've sold a house, brilliant, there we go, we've made some products, our products have gone, that's great. But actually it doesn't stop there, does it? Actually, there's a responsibility around, well, what is the context within the service that I'm providing? What do my products do? How will they be deconstructed? How will they be used? What's the quality of what we're trying to do? So it's such a whole wide-ranging gambit of things. And then coming back to Rory's point earlier about the role of procurement. So there's now an ISO standard around sustainable procurement. So not only have we got, maybe a few years ago, a quality bucket here, an environmental bucket here, kind of a procurement thingy over here, risk over here, supply chain assurance over here, responsible sourcing, ethical sourcing, whatever that might mean. Human rights in supply chains, going back a number of years, these were very much, in my view, seen as isolated buckets of activity. So a company might do something over here, do something over here. They might be very well known for having great, human rights practices and due diligence in their supply chains. People often talk about retailers and people like companies like the Body Shop, Anita Roddick, and their foundation, or the principles of that organisation were very much around the human rights against animal testing and so on. Sold out to L'Oreal, interesting. And then L'Oreal have just sold them back to somebody else. Interesting again. So all these things, I believe, are actually now starting to evolve. So as each of these buckets kind of starts to get a bit bigger, our Venn diagram of issues and standards starts to evolve itself and actually starts to overlap. So what is the role for a responsible sourcing standard? What is the role for an ethical sourcing standard? What do they mean? Because if you're a client, a house builder, a product manufacturer, an architect, or anybody, you want to have some comfort and understand, well, I'm trying to specify something to give myself and my client some greater assurance and comfort around responsible ethical sourcing considerations, but what is it that they're getting? And I think this comes back to a broader issue around training, awareness, competency, that we as a business and in the role that we occupy in the value chain as custodian of some of these standards in this space have got to do more, to engage with more people, to reach out, to explain, well, actually, if somebody has got a 6001 responsible sourcing of their concrete blocks or whatever it might be, actually, well, as part of that assessment, they will have need to give some assurances around, where they buy their constituent materials from, actually their own governance around procurement. Actually, they need to talk about their own advocacy around carbon, energy, waste, water, traditional environmental issues, talk about the training of their own staff, ethical business behaviour in terms of anti-bribery and corruption. So quite a few of these things touch upon so many issues that actually it's so much more than just a single isolated issue or standard. So as they all become more and more mature, part of my job is to make sure that the standards that we have in the BRE continuously evolve as well. So that actually it's value on top of value. Because if organisations have 9001, have 14, or have systems in place already, we want to be able to then provide things that actually give more value on top. So as all this landscape is evolving, and I'll touch upon things of the last couple of years in a moment, we've got to make sure it's continuously reflecting what is going on and how it's moving on. The other bit I just want to kind of touch upon briefly is around, obviously, the extension to that in terms of modern slavery. So many of you will be aware that over the last couple of years, we've had the Modern Slavery Act, so organisations that turn over more than 36 million have to declare and be more transparent about their activities, produce a statement, amongst lots of other things. We ourselves as BRE, we've had to comply to the Act, and our statement is on our website as well. So again, another example of how all these things are evolving around us. Organisations need to become more transparent. Availability of data, coming back to Rory's point, is becoming more and more proliferated. But actually, if we have a situation where there's lots more data and lots more information, how can we start to distill that to create more value-based choices, actually? Because there's another school of thought that actually if you give people too much choice, then they don't actually know what to do. So we've got to kind of reconcile all of this together. So I think the role of procurement, risk, environmental, social, good governance, all these things are starting to homogenise, come together. How do we build more transparent, credible supply chains? We've just started a piece of work around blockchain technology and what might that mean for the built environment. So this is the technology that sits behind Bitcoin and all those other exciting things. So you might think, good grief, why are we trying to look at something that's so kind of at the front edge of sort of technology and so on? But I believe that actually if there's a way to look at the ledger of things and how we account for supply chains and how we account for our transactions, perhaps there's an application for us in the built environment. So I think absolutely there's all sorts of exciting aspects to this part of what we're trying to do, but fundamentally with so much of a need for housing in our nation, the scale, the volume that we need, the quality we've got to try and build into it, and so many of these choices that we are starting to make, I think actually we can build in so much more of these better choices in a holistic sense around ethical and social good governance, around the products and the systems that we want to put into our assets for the next 30, 40, 100 years, whatever long these buildings are going to be around for. Building them in now will ensure a greater legacy for the future. Thank you.
Okay, let's see if we can squeeze in one question. Have we got a burning question out there in the audience? No, that's fine. I think...
if nobody's volunteering, I can.
Just wait one moment. There's a microphone. And just say who you are, who you work for.
I'm Riyasu from Catalyst Housing. From your presentation, I can understand the landscape of ethical and responsible sourcing is quite complex. But have you created a knowledge base that can simplify that? That as organizations you can tap into and drag and drop, kind of, it looks complex to me and I can be lost with your presentation, but have you made it simple in such a way that people can easily source and understand what's happening?
Yes, we have. So I'm very conscious not to plug my own wares, as it were, are these things, but we have a range of publications available from all good bookshops. No, just kidding. So about a week, 2 weeks ago, Gordon, we produced a wider network. So you're absolutely right, because you can make this incredibly complex, and then it puts people off, and then you think, well, where will I start? How can I even start? That's understanding what it means to me, because your needs as a business will be different to Rory's, different to Paul's, different to Gordon's, whatever. So if we can, if Seam is here, as part of the circulation of the notes thereafter, we can send out the link to APRE. So APRE is the action program for responsible and ethical sourcing that we have been running with Loughborough University for almost 7 years now. And it's to do exactly what you've just alluded to, in terms of, well, actually, there's a lot going on, but can we kind of bring people together to actually talk about the core issues that matter so they can actually go and do something? And a few weeks ago, so if you look at the BRE Twitter feed, about 2 weeks ago, I think, we produced a freely available, downloadable PDF white paper, which specifically talks around a broad range of issues and areas and tries to map out a maturity pathway to say, well, actually, if I'm here, how can I get a bit better? And that I'd highly recommend. That's something that I think would exactly answer what you're looking for.
Excellent. I think you've done a wonderful job selling your wares as well. So
I've tried.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.